Hello everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Fountain of Life podcast. For the past 5 episodes, we have been looking at the very interesting subject of the stories that we tell ourselves. And today is going to be another one. But do you know that there is so much pressure on us to self-improve? And because of that pressure, we tend to look at our lives and there are things that we are not happy about. There are things that have been difficult and challenging moments in our lives. And all of those things sometimes pushes us to take stock of our lives and point fingers at situations, at people, at ourselves. But what that does to us is shapes the story that we tell ourselves about events. Sometimes they may not always be true, but the pressure to be a better or a different person is so strong that these stories really can help us or they can harm us. And what it does ultimately is that it makes it difficult to accept ourselves, because there's all this pressure that we bring on ourselves to be different than who we are. And that can be damaging sometimes. And that can put restrictions on what we can become, how we can fit in society, and all of that. The internal wars that goes on because of the pressure to be different is so strong. Why don't you join me today in today's episode for the next few minutes as we look at a biblical model of how those pressures can shape us, but at the same time also they help us to find redemption.
Lord, you are the fountain of life, restorer of my soul. I worship you today. Lord, you are the fountain of life, restorer of my soul. I worship you today. Lord, you are the fountain of life, restorer of my soul. Worship you today. Lord, you are the fountain of you restore my soul.
This is your host, Charles Zuta, and I welcome you once again to today's episode. So, we want to look at another episode of the stories that we tell ourselves. And there's a very beautiful model of a parable that Jesus spoke that helps us to conceptualize how, when we look at our lives and the situations that we are in, it drives a desire for change. And sometimes the stories that we use to justify or to lead us in that quest for that change, to be different people, to improve, to thrive, and all of those words that they throw at us today, it can lead us to make decisions that ultimately might not be beneficial or helpful to us. So today we want to turn to Luke chapter 15. It's a very popular story and I'm sure you've heard it over and over again. I'm talking about the parable of the prodigal son. So in Luke chapter 15 from verse 11, Jesus told this parable. Luke chapter 15 carries a lot of redemption stories about how God approaches the lost. So there's the lost sheep, the lost coin, and now the lost son. So we want to look at the minutiae of what is going on in the life of this young man, even as he's considered a lost son. So in Luke chapter 15, this is what the Bible says. Then he said, that is the young man. So that's Jesus said, then he said, Jesus said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger one of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of the goods that falls to me. So he, that's the father, divided to them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. Let's pause here as we explore this parable that Jesus spoke. A lot of us view this parable as a story of the prodigal son, but actually it is the story of the loving father, because if you look at the theme in the whole of Luke chapter 15, it's about somebody trying so hard to recover something. The coin, the sheep, all of it speaks to the heart of God. And so this one is also actually about the Father, the extension of grace and mercy and all of that. But back to the story. Over here, this young man, we don't know what the internal discussion is. We don't know what has been going on with him. His father is rich. He's in his father's house, and everything, of course, must seem to be going well. But then there is something going on. There's an inner turmoil. For whatever reason, maybe he compares himself to somebody else, or he might have seen something going on in the society. Like in our days, there are people on the internet who are showing us what fancy life can be like. Somebody trying to influence society to choose certain fashion or live in a certain way. We don't know whether they had influences back in the day. But this young man told himself a story that where I am is not good enough. That is the long and short of the narrative that he built for himself. The status quo is not good enough. This is not good enough. So he must have been pointing fingers to himself, pointing fingers to what is going on in his house, pointing fingers to everything else. And so there's the pressure for him to have transformation, to have abundance and, level up. All the terms that we are seeing today, there's nothing new. It's always been there. Humanity is society. We are society. We are social beings. So we connect. We see each other. We things are bounced off each other. So there's always that pressure for us to want to self-improve, or to have self-criticism. So obviously this young man has brought himself under some kind of pressure that, the current circumstance isn't good enough. And there are many people in our world today who have the same feeling. They may look at their life in the past. There's a lot of maybe shame. There's a lot of blaming. There's a lot of things that have gone on that it's led them to believe that they have to do something about their circumstances. And the tragedy is, if it's not well thought through, or whatever it is based on a false narrative or wrong interpretation of the circumstances, then it's going to push them or push us to make decisions that ultimately might not lead to our good. So I don't know how much resources this young man had to determine and evaluate the quality of the choice that he has made. And if you notice very carefully why I said this is actually the parable of a loving father, the father respected the choice and the will of his son. He could have said, hey, young man, let's stop here. Let's pause. Let's think through this another time. Sleep over it a bit and let's see what can happen. Maybe he did that. We don't know. Jesus didn't say. But the long and short of it is that he respected the choice of his son. He respected the will of the young man. So he gathered everything, divided among the two, and gave the younger son his share. And so, not many days after, this young man, Bible says, he gathered all together and journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. How many times have we not made choices and decisions just because of a narrow focus that we've had. Maybe this young man, he thinks he's not having enough fun in life. Or maybe he thinks life is not going the way he thinks. He's planned his life in a very narrow focus. And so he needs to make a change to meet those timelines without counting the cost. That is a critical piece. Because when we keep telling ourselves the same story over and over without thinking through it, it distills out reason, and we begin to focus more and more on fears and anxieties and shames and all those things, so that it begins to keep us in a little bubble that we've created for ourselves, and we only listen to that bubble. Nothing else can pierce through, no reason, nothing, because we've said it over and over and over to ourselves, the same story, and each iteration of that story comes with its own new fears and its own new anxieties. So obviously, this is what this young man had been going through. We don't know how long he's incubated this thought before he went to his father. But obviously, he told himself a story, and he didn't quite count the risk. So what happened was, when he went, he cut himself off from his family, from everybody, of course, the source of everything that he has. And then he blew everything, all the money that he had, his resources, everything, he just blew it. So obviously, he didn't count the cost. So let's see, if we make those choices and decisions based on very narrow stories that we're telling ourselves and we don't count the cost, what happens to us? Verse 14, but when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave to him anything. So obviously, because he hadn't counted the cost of the stories that he told himself, based on those narrow opinions or narrow choices that he thinks are going to make his life better, based on how he sees himself, what happens is that the reality of those decisions begin to show up. He had no more resources. Perhaps he didn't have the career set to thrive where he has placed himself. Maybe he didn't fit into the society coming from his background. So what happens when we don't count the cost and we don't push ourselves? The reality of those choices begin to bite. Maybe we think we are left behind by everybody else in society when it came to dating a relationship, maybe a young person. And then you rush into a relationship without thinking through it, without realizing what you ought to do, preparing yourself well and getting the knowledge and all that you need. It's just a matter of time before those choices begin to bite back. So in much the same way, this young man found himself in that kind of situation. The choices he made based on that narrow decision and the story that he told himself in a very narrow way without evaluating the risk and the decisions began to bite. But the good news is this: irrespective of where we find ourselves under those kind of circumstances, if you're a person of faith, there is redemption for you. Whatever it is, even if you are not a person of faith, there is always possibility for redemption where you can have a do-over. But the good news here, based on the lessons that we are learning, the do-over even begins with another story that you have to tell yourself. So that is what happened to this young man. In Luke chapter 15, if we continue reading from verse 17, this is what the Bible says. But when he came to himself, that is a very interesting phrase Jesus used. When he came to himself. So where has he been all along? Remember when we did the episode when we started this, we looked at the story that we tell ourselves, and that is the story of the rich fool, the one whose barn flourished, and his field flourished, and his field had an abundance, and he built barns, and he told himself, "Soul, rejoiced. You have so much laid out for you." And the Bible says, Jesus said, God told him that night, "Thou fool, today your soul shall be required of you. And who shall it be? All that you've accumulated for yourself." So he told himself a story. Like all the other episodes that we've seen, each of the protagonists told themselves a story. Here we have this young man now trying to find a path of redemption. And that path of redemption begins with a trigger story. He came to himself. So the question is, where has he been all along? So that is why I said the narrow stories that we tell ourselves, based on our worldview, based on maybe bad experiences or things that we have gone through, the narrative that we build, when they are inherently wrong and they feed into how society views us, the shame and all those other things, that we find it hard for self-acceptance in the moment, and we are so desperate for change, we lose our identity, who we are. It's like suddenly something else has taken over us. That something is the effect of those stories that we told ourselves. So this young man came to himself. Suddenly, he was captured into a new phase of thinking. So he had to tell himself a new story. A new gateway has to open in his life. And this is what he said. "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to eat, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." Amazing. He came to himself. So he told himself another story. A redemptive story. A story that will lead him away from the pain that he has orchestrated in his life. So this gives us a very important lesson. There is always opportunity for do-over. Maybe we've told ourselves stories that had led us into places that we shouldn't be. We can equally tell ourselves stories that can lead us to the place of redemption. That is very important to know. Like, life is a matter of series of decisions that we make. If we want life to live it according to God's plan and God's purposes, we have to change the stories that we build around the truths that we know about God. So this young man told himself a story about the truth of his father's house. That was the hook. He remembered his father's house. So in much the same way, the paths of redemption, however far we strayed in life, however many mistakes, however, decisions that we've made, when we remember God's house, when we remember what used to be there, what the good things used to be in our lives, we can still find the paths of redemption. So the paths that leads to destruction begins with a story, and the paths that leads to redemption also begins with a story. That is the crucial truth that I want us to remember from this episode. We can undo the narrative and rebuild new narratives for our lives by telling ourselves stories that are based on the truths about who God is, what our status is in Him, and what He's prepared to do for us. So he told himself, right now, look at me, look at how my life has become. So he compares himself to the servants that are in his father's house, and he contrasts his current existence with the existence of those servants. So he tells himself a story, and then he plans an action that he has to take, including even the words that he's going to tell his father. That is a path of redemption. With our hearts, believe unto righteousness, and with our mouth we confess unto salvation. So this young man believed with his heart that there is something good in his father's house, and he used his mouth to tell himself a story. That this is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to do. So the beautiful thing is that he told himself stories of how his father is going to receive him. He's even prepared himself that he doesn't deserve even to come to that place of being considered a son. He's happy to just be like a servant. Those are all stories he told himself. But is that really the truth about his father's heart and about how his father wants to relate to him? Perhaps not. But the key thing is that he made a decision based on the story, based on the facts of where he is to where he could have been. And with that, he took steps to lead to the place of redemption. That is the heart of the Father. And he wanted to be there. He wanted to experience that love again, experience that good thing that his father could offer. His perception of his father, is that really the case? You see, will his father treat him as a servant? Would that be the case? We all know what happened. So the Bible says in verse 20, and he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So he followed through with what he said he wanted to do. He told himself a story in that far, far away country. And he had a plan. But the good news is that however low he had sunk, however low he told himself about that father, it didn't even turn out that way. The Bible says, but the father said to his servants, bring out the best robes and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. So his perception of his father is far from the truth. Will it be that the story he told himself when he left his father's house was also flawed? Did he see his father as a loving person in a good light and all of that? It could be the case that this young man didn't have a good understanding of who his father was. He thought he was having it so bad in his father's house that he needed to take his inheritance and leave. And that led him into a lot of problems and mess. When he came to himself and he came back to his father's house, he built a narrative, but that narrative also has a flaw. And that flaw had to do with his perception of his father. That the father should just take him as a servant. But as we are seeing here, the father called him my son. And the actions that son took was equivalent to dying. That son was practically dead. He walked away from everything that his father could have done for him. And then when he came back, the father considered him alive. So the decisions or the stories that we tell ourselves will lead us to the place where we are physically, spiritually dead, away from the resources and everything that is available to us. And we can also tell ourselves another story that will bring us to that place where the Father will consider us as being alive. Alive to His love, alive to Him, back to where we belong. So the stories that we tell ourselves are critical. They can take us away from the resources that are in God, or they can bring us back to find restoration. Thank you so much if you joined us today, and these episodes have been a blessing to you. God willing, we have one more episode on this subject to look at some of the practical steps we can take to shape our narrative if those choices and decisions we have made are leading us to the place where we can be considered as dead, or we are struggling those decisions based on those stories we told ourselves. We can still find redemption. Make those choices based on the new narrative we tell ourselves. So don't miss that episode. But if you don't already subscribe to this podcast, I encourage you to do. Hit the subscribe button at the end of this episode. And also, you can follow us on Amazon, Spotify, and all the places where you have your good podcast. You can download it and listen to it at your leisure. And we want to hear from you. You can drop us a note, your comments. We appreciate it. We'll be happy to continue sharing fellowship with you. Thank you so much, and may God richly bless you.
Fountain of my life, I worship you today. Lord, only you are. Yes, Lord. You restore my soul. I worship you today. Yeah.
The book of Matthew 11:28-29. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest